I never thought I'd find myself standing outside a hotel room, my heart pounding as muffled laughter trickled through the door. After 3.5 years of marriage, the woman I trusted most was on the other side of that door, with someone else. I didn't knock. I didn't confront her. Instead, I made a decision that would change my life. I turned and walked away, quietly leaving her betrayal behind. But before we delve deeper into this story, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you enjoy tales like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Kathy slammed her coffee cup onto the table, the sharp clink echoing against the wood. She had rehearsed this confrontation for weeks, imagining every possible reaction Chad might have. But this cool, detached stare was maddening. "Damn it, Chad, don't you care?" Her voice cracked as frustration spilled out, breaking the dam she'd tried so hard to hold together. Chad didn't even flinch. He calmly folded his newspaper, his deliberate movements more insulting than any outburst could have been. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, as if they were discussing the weather rather than the collapse of their marriage. "I stopped caring when you stopped being a wife." His words were like a knife, sharper than Kathy anticipated. She opened her mouth to respond, but the lump in her throat silenced her. His unwavering gaze met hers, as though he'd been waiting years to say those exact words. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" she demanded, masking her unease with anger. Leaning forward, Chad rested his elbows on the table. For the first time, something flickered in his eyes. Not anger, not sadness, but something colder. Resignation. "It means," he said slowly, "I've spent the past year watching you lie, watching you play house while sneaking off to meet someone else. And you know what, Kathy? I don't even care anymore. So congratulations, you win. You can leave now." Kathy's breath hitched. This wasn't the Chad she knew. The one who avoided conflict, who bent over backward to keep the peace. The man in front of her was a stranger, and that realization unsettled her more than anything else. "You think you're so righteous," she snapped, her voice trembling. "You're not perfect either, Chad. Don't act like this is all on me." But Chad refused to take the bait. Rising from his chair, he moved toward the door, his movements as calculated as his words. "Maybe I'm not," he said, his tone unyielding. "But at least I've never pretended to be someone I'm not. Have a nice life, Kathy." And with that, he walked out, the door clicking shut behind him. Kathy stood frozen, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. On the other side of that door, Chad exhaled slowly, his breath steadying as his mind calculated his next steps. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. It was the result of months of preparation. Now, it was time to execute his plan. He headed straight for the office, grabbing his laptop. In the stillness of the early morning, the sound of his typing echoed through the house as he logged into their shared bank accounts. His expression remained stoic as he moved funds from their joint savings into his personal account, one transfer at a time. He left just enough behind to keep the accounts functional, but not enough for Kathy to wreak havoc. Next, he tackled the credit cards. With methodical precision, he canceled every shared account, ensuring Kathy couldn't accumulate more debt in his name. He made a mental note to monitor the statements in case she attempted anything before the changes went through. Shifting seamlessly to his investments, Chad sold off a few underperforming stocks he'd earmarked earlier, consolidating his finances further. As the confirmations trickled in, a sense of satisfaction washed over him. Not out of spite, but self-preservation. Why now? The question flickered in his mind uninvited as he scanned the emails piling into his inbox. For years, he'd endured Kathy's coldness, her lies, and the widening chasm between them. He had made excuses for her, convinced himself that things would improve. But the truth hit like a freight train the day he saw those photos. Tyrone's smug grin and Kathy's familiar smile, one he hadn't seen in years. He had clung on for too long, not out of love, but a desperate need to prove he hadn't wasted nearly a decade of his life. Letting go was harder than he imagined. But now that it was done, it felt oddly freeing. Chad closed his laptop and picked up his phone. A quick call to his lawyer, Alex, confirmed the next steps. The divorce papers would be filed by week's end. Alex had been prepared for months, and with the evidence Chad had gathered, their case was airtight. Infidelity, paired with financial misdeeds, wasn't well received by judges in their state. As the call ended, Chad stared out the window at the meticulously maintained lawn he had cared for over the years. The house, once a symbol of stability, now felt like a facade. But that was fine. He would rebuild, piece by piece. He'd done it before. Finally, he logged out of their shared streaming services, changed the Wi-Fi password, and removed Kathy's access to the grocery delivery account. Petty? Perhaps. But it symbolized reclaiming control over every aspect of his life. By the time Kathy returned to the living room hours later, her access to his world had been severed entirely. Chad was gone, along with everything she had once taken for granted. It had all started with the suspicion Chad couldn't shake. Kathy's late nights, the distant look in her eyes. It was subtle at first, but became more glaring with time. Instead of confronting her, Chad chose a different approach. He needed proof, not speculation. The memory replayed vividly in his mind. A cramped office with peeling paint and the faint smell of stale coffee. Across the desk sat the private investigator, a shrewd man with sharp eyes and a sharper tone. Sliding a folder across the desk, he delivered the news without sympathy. "She's been meeting him at motels for months," the investigator said. "Different locations, same guy, Tyrone. Here's the proof." Chad hesitated before opening the folder. When he finally did, the photos inside left no doubt. Kathy walking arm in arm with another man. Her laughter frozen mid-moment. The two entering a motel room. Each image felt like a blow to the gut, but Chad's expression remained neutral. "I didn't want to believe it," Chad said quietly, his voice steadier than his emotions. "Most people don't," the investigator replied, leaning back in his chair. "But they don't hire me unless they already know. I just confirm it." Chad closed the folder and slid it into his briefcase. "Thanks, that's all I need." The investigator raised an eyebrow. "Most guys blow up, confront her, or kick her out the same day. You sure you're not going to do something drastic?" Chad offered a tight smile. "Number timing is everything." The investigator shrugged. "Your call. Just don't let it fester. Secrets like this have a way of eating you alive." Walking out of the office, the folder tucked securely under his arm, Chad's mind buzzed with plans. Every instinct screamed at him to confront Kathy immediately, but he knew better. An emotional reaction would only hand her the advantage. If he wanted to leave with his dignity and his assets intact, he needed a strategy. In the weeks that followed, Chad played the part of the oblivious husband. He greeted Kathy with the same measured tone, maintained their routine, and even organized date nights. Every fake smile, every fabricated excuse from her, chipped away at him. But he held firm, knowing patience was his greatest ally. In hindsight, he realized waiting wasn't just about preparation. It was about reclaiming control. By biding his time, Chad took back the power Kathy had stolen. And when the time came to confront her, he would be ready. "The second I found out about Tyrone, but I didn't," Chad said, his tone cold and deliberate. "I gave you time. I let you keep pretending this life was yours to ruin. Not anymore." Kathy's defiance faltered, her shoulders stiffening as she tried to regain control. "You don't have the right to treat me like this. I've put just as much into this house as you have," she snapped. Chad crossed his arms, his gaze steady and unyielding. "You're right. You did put something in. Deception, lies, infidelity. Tell me, Kathy, how much do those add to the property value?" Her mouth opened, ready to retort, but no words came. The silence that followed was oppressive, broken only by Chad's steady breathing. Finally, Kathy spun on her heel, muttering under her breath as she stormed out of the room. Chad watched her leave, his expression impassive. The fight wasn't over, but he knew one thing. This was the beginning of the end. Later that evening, Chad sat at the dining table, his fingers drumming rhythmically on the wood. Kathy stood across from him, her arms crossed, and her expression a mixture of frustration and defiance. The tension between them was almost tangible, and Chad knew it was time to lay everything bare. "You think this is just about Tyrone, don't you?" he said, breaking the silence. Kathy narrowed her eyes. "What are you talking about?" Leaning forward, Chad's voice dropped but didn't waver. "I'm talking about the others, the men before him. You think I didn't notice, Kathy? You think I've been blind all these years?" Her expression flickered for a split second, but she quickly masked it with indignation. "You're delusional. There were no other men. You're making this up to justify your own coldness." Chad let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "I stayed quiet the first 3 times. Not anymore." Kathy's composure faltered as Chad pulled a small stack of photos from a folder on the table and slid them toward her. Hesitantly, her hands trembling slightly, she picked them up. The images spoke louder than her protests. Hotel lobbies, lingering glances, moments of unmistakable intimacy with different men. "This doesn't mean anything," she stammered, her voice pitching higher. "These could be friends, co-workers." "Save it!" Chad cut her off, his voice icy. "The first time, I thought it was a mistake. Late business dinners, canceled plans. I gave you the benefit of the doubt. The second time, I told myself it was just a rough patch and we could work through it. By the third, I realized you didn't care about fixing anything." Her face went pale, and she stumbled over her words. You never said anything." "Because I wanted to believe you were better than this," Chad said, his gaze piercing. "Do you know what it feels like to be invisible in your own marriage? To watch the person you love lie to your face while pretending everything is fine?" Tears welled in Kathy's eyes, but Chad wasn't moved. "You don't get to cry now," he said, his voice steady and cold. "This isn't about your guilt or excuses. This is about accountability." Her shoulders slumped, and she dropped the photos back on the table. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Chad shook his head as he pushed his chair back and stood. "That's your excuse? You didn't mean to betray me repeatedly? You didn't mean to destroy our marriage?" Kathy sobbed softly, her gaze fixed on the floor. But Chad was done. Turning away, he delivered the final blow. "Intentions don't matter. Actions do, and yours have consequences." "Me Duchessa." The following evening, Chad sat on the porch, the golden glow of the setting sun casting long shadows across the yard. His thoughts were a swirling storm, replaying the confrontation with Kathy over and over. Just as he considered heading inside, the crunch of gravel underfoot caught his attention. Maria approached, her steps light but purposeful, a small plate covered with a cloth in her hands. "I thought you could use something warm," she said gently, holding out the plate with a tentative smile. Chad accepted it with a nod, setting it down beside him. "Thanks, Maria. You didn't have to." "I know," she replied, settling onto the step beside him. For a moment, silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but charged with unspoken words. Finally, Maria drew a deep breath, as though bracing herself. "Chad," she began, her voice soft yet steady, "I've been watching you carry this burden for so long. You've always been the strong one, keeping everything together when no one else noticed. But you don't have to do it alone anymore." Chad turned to her, his brows furrowing slightly. "Maria," she raised a hand, cutting him off gently. "Let me finish." Her tone was insistent but kind, her eyes filled with sincerity. "You're worth fighting for, Chad. Let me prove it." Her words hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. Chad looked at her, really seeing her for the first time. There was no pretense in her expression, no hesitation in her gaze. She wasn't offering pity, she was offering hope. "Maria," he said finally, his voice quieter than he intended. "I'm not sure I'm ready for whatever this is." She nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "I'm not asking for anything right now. I just want you to know that when you're ready, I'll be here. No pressure, no expectations." Her honesty disarmed him, cutting through the walls he had built. For the first time in months, maybe years, he felt a glimmer of hope. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice steady. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself a small, genuine smile. Chad raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his chair. "And yet, here we are," he said calmly. Tyrone nodded, guilt etched clearly on his face. "I believed her lies. She told me you were abusive, controlling, that you didn't care about her. She painted a picture of a man who made her life unbearable. I fell for it, and for that, I'm sorry." Chad studied him for a moment, his gaze steady. "At least you're honest about it now. That's more than she's ever been." The silence that followed was heavy, though not entirely hostile. Tyrone reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small envelope, sliding it across the table. "What's this?" Chad asked, his tone wary. "It's yours," Tyrone said simply. "Your lottery ticket. She gave it to me a while back, claiming it was a gift she didn't want you to know about. At first, I didn't think much of it, but recently, I checked it, Chad. It's a winner. A big one." Chad blinked, his composure faltering. "You're serious?" Tyrone nodded solemnly. "Completely. I couldn't keep it, not after everything. It's yours, fair and square." For a moment, Chad was at a loss for words. He opened the envelope and stared at the ticket, his mind racing. He couldn't even recall buying it, but the implications were overwhelming. "Why?" Chad finally asked, his voice quieter now. Why give it back? Tyrone sighed, his expression weary. Because I was part of Kathy's mess, and I don't want to be anymore. I've made enough mistakes, but keeping that ticket would have been the worst one. Chad looked at him, searching for any sign of insincerity, but found none. Tyrone raised an eyebrow, as if daring Chad to question his motives further, but said nothing more. Chad leaned back, emotions swirling, vindication, shock, and an odd sense of gratitude. Extending his hand, he waited. After a brief hesitation, Tyrone shook it. Thanks, Chad said, his tone steady, for finally doing the right thing. Tyrone offered a faint smile before rising to leave. Chad watched him go, then glanced back at the ticket. In his hands, it felt like more than just a winning slip. It was a symbol of a fresh start. For once, life seemed to be tipping back in his favor. The courtroom was silent, the atmosphere thick with tension, as Chad sat beside Alex at the plaintiff's table. Across the room, Kathy fidgeted, her attorney whispering urgently in her ear. The judge, a stern-faced man with sharp features, entered and called the court to order. Alex began with confidence, presenting Chad's case with precision. Your Honor, we have substantial evidence of infidelity, financial misconduct, and property damage caused by the defendant. My client has acted in good faith throughout this ordeal, but the defendant clearly has not. As Alex spoke, he laid out the evidence. Photos taken by the private investigator, financial records documenting Kathy's unauthorized spending, and, most damning of all, the security footage capturing her rampage through the house. Each piece painted a vivid picture, leaving little room for defense. Kathy's lawyer attempted to shift the narrative, leaning heavily on emotional appeals. Your Honor, my client has been under extreme emotional stress. Her actions, while regrettable, were driven by that turmoil. She is sincerely remorseful and seeks a fair resolution. Kathy dabbed her eyes with a tissue, her tears appearing genuine, but the judge's expression remained stern, his tone unyielding as he turned to her. Mrs. Carter, he said firmly, remorse does not excuse accountability. The evidence presented here is irrefutable. Your actions have consequences, and it's clear you acted with reckless disregard for your husband and your shared property. Kathy's face went pale, her sobs quieting as the weight of the judge's words sank in. When Alex delivered his closing argument, it was measured and decisive. Your Honor, my client is not seeking revenge. He is seeking justice. After enduring years of dishonesty and betrayal, he deserves to walk away with what is rightfully his, free from undue financial burden. The judge nodded, his ruling swift. I am ruling in favor of the plaintiff. Mr. Carter will retain ownership of the marital home and his personal assets. The defendant is not entitled to alimony, given her actions. Furthermore, the restraining order remains in effect. This court is adjourned. As the gavel struck, Chad exhaled deeply, a weight lifting off his shoulders. Alex turned to him with a small, victorious smile. The judge didn't buy her sob story. Justice is served. Chad glanced across the room at Kathy, who sat frozen, disbelief etched across her face. He felt no sense of triumph, only relief. The fight was over. He had won, not out of spite, but out of a need to reclaim his life. Walking out of the courtroom, Chad felt the sun's warmth on his face, a stark contrast to the coldness of the past months. For the first time in years, he felt unburdened, the possibilities of a new beginning ahead of him. The weeks following the court's decision were unkind to Kathy. Without alimony and forced to leave the marital home, her sense of stability crumbled. The life she once commanded with confidence had fallen apart. Initially, Kathy tried to maintain a facade of independence, renting a small apartment in the city. But without Chad's income to rely on, the financial strain mounted. Bills piled up. Credit card debt, overdue rent, and the costs of the lifestyle she could no longer afford. Eventually, Kathy faced the harsh reality. She had no choice but to move back into her parents' modest suburban home. The move was quiet, done under the cover of night to avoid the judgmental stares of neighbors who once envied her seemingly perfect life. Her childhood bedroom, once a symbol of hope, now felt stifling. Surrounded by outdated furniture and pastel wallpaper, she felt the weight of her fall from grace. The reality hit hardest during awkward family dinners. Her parents, though well-meaning, asked cautious questions about her plans. Once the center of attention, Kathy now shrank under their pitying gazes. I'll figure it out, she muttered one evening, pushing her food around her plate. But even she didn't believe her own words. Attempts to rebuild relationships proved fruitless. Tyrone, having distanced himself after learning of her lies, ignored her calls. Former friends, once drawn to her confidence and charisma, had moved on. Kathy found herself isolated, her social circle as hollow as the promises she had once made. For the first time in years, Kathy had to confront herself. The mirror no longer reflected a glamorous, self-assured woman. Instead, it showed someone humbled, broken, and uncertain of where to go next. Meanwhile, Chad found solace in Maria's quiet support. She never pushed for more than he was ready to give, showing her care through small gestures, home-cooked meals, check-in messages, or moments shared silently on the porch. One evening, as the sunset painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, Chad opened up in a way he hadn't for years. "It's strange," he admitted, his voice steady but tinged with vulnerability. "For so long, I felt like I was just going through the motions, like I was invisible." Maria leaned closer, her hand lightly touching his. "You're not invisible, Chad. You never were. You just didn't have someone who truly saw you." Her words struck a chord deep within him. For the first time in years, Chad felt genuinely cared for. Not out of obligation, but because someone truly wanted to. As the evening stretched on, Maria's sincerity became undeniable. Her kindness wasn't performative. It was real, steady, and healing. In her, Chad began to see not just a friend, but the promise of something more. A chapter that felt hopeful rather than daunting. Kathy's letter was filled with remorse as she reflected on the hurt she had inflicted and took full accountability for her actions. She confessed to allowing her selfish desires to cloud her thinking, ultimately destroying what could have been a promising future together. "You were a good man, Chad. Far better than I deserved. I'm not asking for forgiveness, but I needed to tell you I see everything clearly now. I hope you find the happiness you're worthy of." Chad put the letter aside, his emotions calm but detached. Apologies had come too late. The marks Kathy had left behind were a testament to all he had survived and overcome. He no longer felt anger, but wasn't compelled to respond either. "Some bridges are best left burned," he muttered softly, folding the letter and slipping it back into its envelope. Rather than reopen old wounds, Chad chose to focus on his current life, the one he was steadily building, surrounded by peace and genuine care. Kathy's apology was hers to carry, not his to reconcile. He placed the envelope in a drawer, not out of sentimentality, but as a quiet reminder of a chapter he had finally closed. As time went on, Chad's bond with Maria grew stronger. Their relationship was rooted in trust, mutual understanding, and simple, joyful moments that felt effortless. Unlike the chaotic relationships of Chad's past, being with Maria was refreshingly uncomplicated. She didn't just notice him, she cherished him, flaws and all. One crisp autumn afternoon, they were in Chad's backyard, planting bulbs Maria assured him would bloom beautifully in the spring. She knelt in the dirt, her hair falling loosely around her face as she laughed at Chad's clumsy attempts with the spade. "You're definitely better with spreadsheets than shovels," she joked, grinning up at him. "Hey," Chad replied, feigning offense as he wiped his forehead on his sleeve. "I'm learning. You're the gardening expert here." Their playful exchange was warm and comforting, a soothing balm to Chad's once wounded heart. In these ordinary moments he realized how much Maria had become woven into his life. Where chaos once thrived, there was now serenity and hope. A few weeks later, Maria invited Chad to her favorite cafe. She seemed both excited and anxious, her fingers nervously fiddling with the rim of her mug as she searched for the right words. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice serious, but her smile betraying her joy. Chad leaned forward, his brows furrowing slightly. "You're starting to make me nervous. What is it?" Maria reached into her bag and retrieved a small rectangular image, sliding it across the table with a growing smile. Chad picked it up and immediately recognized it. It was a sonogram. "We're having twins," Maria said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. Chad blinked, staring at the picture before looking back at Maria. For a moment, he was speechless, overwhelmed by the enormity of the news. Slowly, a grin spread across his face, his eyes lighting up with a mix of amazement and disbelief. "Twins," he repeated, shaking his head in mock exasperation. "Double the trouble, huh?" Maria laughed, tears welling in her eyes as she reached for his hand. "You're going to be amazing, Chad. I just know it." He squeezed her hand, his heart full in a way it hadn't been for years. For the first time in what felt like forever, the future wasn't a source of fear, but a beacon of excitement. With Maria by his side and the promise of a growing family, Chad felt ready to embrace whatever lay ahead. As they left the cafe, the world seemed brighter, the possibilities endless. Together, they were embarking on a new chapter, one that would undoubtedly bring challenges but was also brimming with love, laughter, and the kind of happiness Chad had once thought was out of reach. One quiet afternoon, Chad was surprised by an unexpected knock at his door. When he opened it, Tyrone stood on the porch, holding a worn envelope. The tension between them was palpable, but Tyrone's expression was firm. "I know I'm the last person you want to see," he began earnestly. "But there's something I need to do before I can move on." Chad crossed his arms, cautious but willing to listen. "What is it, Tyrone?" Without hesitation, Tyrone extended the envelope toward him. "It's your share of the lottery winnings," he said plainly. "I couldn't keep it, knowing everything you've been through because of all this." Chad looked at the envelope, then back at Tyrone. "Why now?" he asked, his voice steady but curious. Tyrone sighed deeply, his shoulders slumping slightly. "Because it's the right thing to do. Kathy dragged both of us into her mess, and I've already taken enough from you without even realizing it. This isn't about guilt, it's about closure." Chad hesitated before finally accepting the envelope. Inside was a check with his name on it, the sum significant enough to give anyone pause. He looked back at Tyrone, his expression unreadable. "You didn't have to do this," Chad said at last. "I know," Tyrone replied with a faint smile. "But I wanted to. Maybe it's selfish, but I needed to make things right in some small way." For the first time, Chad glimpsed the man Tyrone could have been without Kathy's influence. He nodded and extended his hand. "Thank you." Tyrone shook it firmly but briefly. "Take care of yourself, Chad. I hope this helps you move forward." As Tyrone walked away, Chad stood on the porch, holding the envelope and feeling an unexpected sense of closure. It wasn't just about the money. It was the gesture, the acknowledgement of the pain caused, and the effort to make amends. Stepping back inside, Chad placed the envelope on the counter and allowed himself a faint smile. The future felt brighter, and for once, the past no longer weighed him down. One evening, Chad sat on the porch, watching the golden hues of the sunset spread across the sky. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of fallen leaves. For the first time in years, he felt a peace that wasn't fleeting, but steady and grounding. He reflected on everything he had endured, the betrayals, the heartbreak, and the struggles. There were moments when it had all felt insurmountable, when the weight of it threatened to crush him. But each time he had found a way to rise, to push through the pain and rebuild. Resilience, he realized, wasn't about pretending everything was fine. It was about confronting the pain, learning from it, and emerging stronger. His gaze drifted to the garden, where Maria was tending to the plants they had cultivated together. Her laughter, soft and warm, floated through the air, and he couldn't help but smile. She had been his anchor, his reminder that hope still existed, even in the darkest of times. The future now felt open, filled with possibilities he hadn't dared to dream of. With Maria by his side and a family on the horizon, Chad finally understood that life's unexpected turns often led to unforeseen blessings. Leaning back in his chair, he sighed contentedly. "Life doesn't always go as planned," he murmured, the words carrying a quiet truth. "But sometimes, it turns out even better than you imagined." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Chad let the moment wash over him, a quiet reminder of how far he had come. The past no longer defined him. While it had shaped him, it no longer held him captive. The road ahead was his to walk, and for the first time in a long while, he looked forward to every step.